get started. So thank you everyone for joining us. This is the first in a webinar series called Into the Neural Abyss. And today we're going to be looking at how to safely use generative AI in your business, and looking at it from a whole bunch of different aspects. So third-party applications like ChatGPT, all the way to bespoke applications that you're building in-house. So I'm Ingrid, I'm the CEO of Geppetto, and we are a software agency based in Harlow, Essex in the UK. We are creating better AI tools specifically for high-risk scenarios. So this is healthcare, education, charities, local government, any application when there's more risk if something were to go wrong. And we're focusing on these areas because it's so useful to have AI tools right now. And we don't want these areas to be excluded just because there is risk. So this is something that we focus on a lot. And then also internally, we use AI tools every day in our organization. ChatGPT is a regular feature in my life at this point. And there is, of course, more and more AI tools coming out that are useful, they save time, they add value, and to not use them just because the risks aren't mitigated would be a shame, frankly. So we're going to be looking a bit at that. Our presenter today is Jamie Tidman. Jamie is the CTO at Geppetto. He has over 11 years experience in software development. Jamie's also worked as an interim CTO in some highly regulated spaces, specifically in financial technologies. He is an ISMS lead implementer, which means that he's looked at implementing information security policies on an organizational level. And maybe most applicable for today, he is leading the technical direction in our organization for AI and building our AI tools. So I will hand the mic to Jamie in a second, but a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We're going to be wrapping up on the dot at 2:30 today. We're going to try to keep this on time as much as possible. At the end, we have put aside a bit of time for any questions. If you're thinking about specific implementation questions or things like that, please drop those into the chat, into the Zoom has a Q&A section. Please put it in there. We're going to be keeping cameras and microphones off for this session, and this will be recorded. This will be posted on YouTube probably next week. This will be on YouTube. So if you do need to leave at any point, that's totally fine. I'm going to be sending an email with the link of the recording next week, so you can take a look at that. And as I mentioned, this is the first in a webinar series, and we are very keen to have your feedback and see how we can make the most out of this and make it useful, make it actionable. We want this to actually be adding value. So we'd love to have your feedback, and I'll send a very, very short survey out afterwards for people to give their thoughts. All right, and without any further ado, I would like to pass it over to Jamie.
Hi, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so today we'll be covering some of the most common chat AI use cases, and we're going to be covering a range of use cases in different companies, from small companies just getting started on their generative AI journey, all the way through to large companies who are looking to build bespoke chat AI solutions hosted in their own infrastructure. We'll then be looking at some of the key risks of generative AI and a few ways to mitigate them. And then finally, as Ingrid said, there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A, so please drop your questions in the chat. So the first use case I'd like to consider is third-party chat apps. So this is your employees using chat applications such as ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, which is Microsoft's product, and Gemini, which is Google's. So the key point to consider is that, first of all, if you don't already have a clear policy on your use of AI, your employees are probably using this already. So there was a business.com survey which found that 47% of the people it asked were already using products like ChatGPT in their businesses, but only 17% reported that their companies had an AI policy. And that means that 30% of the employees are essentially using ChatGPT or similar products without permission or outside of their company's policies. The second thing to really consider here is that when text is put into free versions of these products, they're often used to train AI models. So this is definitely true of ChatGPT's free subscription, for example. If somebody puts in customer data, that is combined with the data from all of the other chatbot users, and it's used to train the next version of those bots. So you really need to consider what happens if that data gets leaked. We've had some vulnerabilities in ChatGPT recently where it's essentially spat out some of its training data, which includes some personally identifiable information. So there is always the risk of that. The next possible thing to consider is that these products may sometimes hallucinate incorrect responses. So a hallucination is where a generative AI may return an incorrect response. ChatGPT is fairly notorious for this, where if it doesn't know the answer, it might be confidently incorrect and it will tell you something that sounds plausible, but it's incorrect. And this is really, really critical if you don't fully understand the types of application that your employees are using, because if those hallucinations happen without your knowledge, that might end up in customer-facing data, or your employees might be taking action based on incorrect information. And then finally, it's important to consider that a lot of these products are US based, or they're based outside the UK and the EU. So you need to consider whether they apply to your data protection requirements, GDPR, whether the data is stored in the UK, etc. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and we use some of these products ourselves, and it saves us so much time, like I'm sure it saves everybody at this webinar. But the key thing is for businesses is having a policy for their use is so essential. So the first thing to do is understand how your employees are currently using AI products. Build a policy that considers whether to allow these products to be used and for what purposes. So this might consider your employees' level of seniority. It might consider the departments that they're in and what kind of data that they're looking at. The next thing you can do in a policy is to make sure that you define exactly what kind of prompts and what kind of text the users can put in. So we have a policy, for example, where we tell our developers, you're not allowed to put in a prompt for ChatGPT that says something like, take a look at this code and tell me how to improve it, and then, a long block of our proprietary code. Instead, what we do encourage them to say is, what's the best way to implement this technology? So the nuance there is that's fine because it's not providing any kind of specific company data and no proprietary information, but you're still getting a useful response from the AI. And then finally, if you do find that your employees are using these products, consider using the enterprise versions in the meantime. So ChatGPT, for example, has a team subscription that doesn't train any of its models on your messages and your company data. But the main thing to consider there is you're essentially at the mercy of their terms and conditions and their information security policies. So make sure that you choose those suppliers well. The second use case we're looking at is customer-facing chatbots. These are often based on very similar technologies. So this is some kind of chatbot builder platform. We're building one ourselves. And these are absolutely fantastic when they're done well. So these are trained on your company's voice. They're essentially brand ambassadors. They're available 24/7, and they can handle critical scenarios where you don't have the resources to respond immediately. They also often have access to your company's data or customer data. So they have access to data sources such as some kind of customer knowledge base, and they can respond with contextual information about the company's problem, the customer's problem. The drawback of that is that you have to be very careful on how it manages that customer data. It's even more critical than internal chat applications because it's using customer text and also customer data. So you have to be even more careful of how that's responded. And if I can give you an example, I recently talked to a customer service chatbot. I sent it a question and the answer contained someone else's email address. So we really need to avoid this kind of cross-contamination of different customers' data. And then the other major vulnerability here is, as I say, it's a brand ambassador, which is fantastic when the chatbot is working well. But if it hallucinates or if it responds with some kind of vulgar language, then this can have a PR impact as well. So one example is the DPD chatbot, which one user convinced to essentially insult DPD, which is a real PR nightmare. And I think after this chat, the user actually convinced the DPD chatbot to write a very insulting haiku about DPD. So using them safely, it's very, very similar controls of looking at the chatbot platform's data protection policies and really considering vendor management here. So the first thing to look at is whether they have any data protection certification. So what you're looking at in the UK is Cyber Essentials is a good start. Depending on the sector, you could be looking at DSPT certification, which is an NHS certification, and ISO 27001, which is an international certification. So if they have some of these, then that's a good sign that they're processing and storing your data in a secure manner. And then secondly, look at whether the data is stored in the UK, or if it's not, whether that's compliant with your policies. The second major thing that you could look at is to, depending on the risk, look at scripted responses. So our sexual health chatbot, which we've been building for the NHS, if that had hallucinated and responded with incorrect medical advice, the impact of that could be very, very high and it could be quite damaging. So our solution that we built for them uses AI to really deeply understand what the user is talking about, but then it matches that intent to a pre-scripted response that we've created. So this has undergone medical review, it's been inspected, we know it's safe. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to respond with tailored responses, but we know it's not hallucinating and we know it's a safe response. So if you're working with a similar high risk scenario, then consider using a scripted chatbot. The final use case we're looking at is a completely bespoke AI chat application. And so this image is from an application we're looking at building at the moment. So this is a completely bespoke AI model that's hosted within our own data center. It has access to a document store, which includes kind of internal company documents. And what that means is that when a chatbot response, it has access to a context of all of the relevant company information, and it can use that to synthesize a response. So what we find is this kind of model is a lot better at reducing the risk of hallucinations, like incorrect responses happening in the first place. And when it does respond and it produces data, it can also cite its sources, which is really valuable in letting the user of a chatbot actually understand this is based on a real source, this is correct, this isn't a hallucination. And then if you're looking at building your own chatbots, the advantages here are that you have complete control over how the data is managed. So it never leaves your own network, it stays within your own infrastructure. You can make sure that it's hosted exactly where you need it to be hosted. You know it's never shared with any third parties. And so it's definitely compliant with your data policies. The problem with that as well, though, that you need to consider is that with great power comes great responsibility, and you are entirely responsible for the information security of that. So you need to make sure that your network is secure, you need to make sure that you're following best practices and you're encrypting data, all of this. So now that we've covered some of the core use cases, I want to explore some of the key risks in more detail. So this applies no matter which of the use cases and company size you're working with. So if you're just getting started with AI and you're using third parties, then you should consider whether your suppliers are looking at these risks and they're doing work to mitigate these risks. If you're implementing your own system, these are the kind of risks you should look at in your requirements and you should build them into your system. The first key risk here is supplier risk. So we found recently within our own system that ChatGPT has had quite a few outages. There was a major outage in November last year for several hours where ChatGPT and OpenAI went down entirely. And then also we found in April 2023 last year that ChatGPT was banned entirely for a brief period due to privacy concerns. So there's often the risk of an individual supplier being unavailable or actually just being out for a very long period of time. And then AI is a very competitive field, so there's also the risk that some of these providers will be gone entirely in a few years. The solutions here build on working with third-party chatbots in that the first step is to identify the key processes that your employees are using and which processes are actually dependent on AI, and have a strategy of what to do with if they fail. So one good approach you could do with this is if, for example, you have a marketing copy generation practice where one of your employees is using ChatGPT or some other text generation system to generate AI content, is maybe do a little bit of a disaster recovery drill where they don't have access to that AI product and see whether they're actually able to do their job. And then you've identified whether there's just an absolute dependency on any one AI product. So one of the solutions to this is using different providers. So if you're a ChatGPT user, consider also in parallel looking at Claude and Gemini or some of the other products, and vice versa if you use Claude. And then if you're an AI implementer, you can look at using vendor agnostic technologies. A couple of examples of this are LangChain and Amazon Bedrock. You can look at similar technologies for different cloud providers. So IBM has one, Microsoft Azure has one. And what these do is they allow you to design a system where most of your chatbot system is completely independent of any one language model. So you could be using OpenAI behind the scenes, but these technologies allow you to very quickly swap them out for different implementations. You could use Titan, which is Amazon's OpenAI model. You could use Llama, which is an open source model. You can really just swap them around without a huge amount of difficulty. And that means that you can consistently evaluate those different models, but also more importantly, if one of them completely disappears from existence, you can move to a different model without much downtime. So if you're building this yourself, you should maybe bear these technologies in mind. And if you're using a third-party developer, then make sure that you ask the question, what happens if this AI model goes down? Do you have an alternative, and how difficult would that be to implement? The second major risk is regulatory risk. So the EU is bringing in the EU AI Act this year, and it's expected to be a very heavy regulation of AI. So they're essentially stratifying different AI use cases based on risk. And the highest risks are applications such as social scoring, facial recognition, and manipulation. And by that, they mean political manipulation, deep fakes, electoral manipulation, that kind of thing. The EU will be entirely banning this. And then other high risk applications, such as in transport, employment, justice, border control, they'll be very, very heavily regulating this. So this will require audits and require very, very heavy oversight. So the UK in comparison is a much lighter touch approach for the moment. They've recently released a response to their white paper, which reinforces their innovation approach to AI and their intention not to heavily regulate AI at all. However, a change of government might be coming in soon, and Labour has signified their intent to toughen up AI regulation. So a Labour win may result in heavier regulation. And we may also have a little bit of a Brussels effect where UK companies might gravitate towards EU regulation anyway. So Making sure that you're compliant with future regulation is difficult because it hasn't come in yet. But some of the ways that you can make sure to future-proof yourself against this is to meet the current international standards for AI adoption. So the two you should be looking at are ISO 27001. So this isn't an AI specific standard, it's a general information security control. But this is a good management system for making sure that the data processed by your AI systems are secure. And the second one is ISO 42001, which builds on those controls, but it includes controls specific to building AI systems. So if you're using third-party suppliers, really make sure that they meet these current controls and we know that they're following best practices right now, or implement them yourself if you're building your own solution. And then finally, it's worth looking at this pyramid of risk and making sure that your own adoption of AI perhaps limits the scope or avoids these kind of high-risk scenarios. So the next risk is accuracy and bias. So it can hallucinate and produce inaccurate responses, which can cause harm if you follow incorrect advice, for example. And then if you're using AI for any decision making, this can result in biases. So for example, Amazon built an AI recruitment system, but it turned out to be very biased against women and they had to pull it. So the solutions for this are really policy based. So first of all, train your employees, if they're using AI products, to recognize hallucinations and understand that AI responses may be incorrect. So they need to essentially have a critical view of the information that's been produced. The second is understanding the processes that you are using to produce AI generated content and label that content to make sure that humans can stay in the loop. So for example, if you're producing marketing content, label that as AI generated, and that way you can ensure that a human always reviews it before it becomes public facing. The next step is to consider which of your processes have too high risk. So HR is a great example of this because the potential impact of biased employment can be pretty huge in terms of litigation. So you may consider avoiding those topics entirely. And then finally, make sure that the process you're replacing isn't biased. So if you were building, for example, a recruitment data set and you found, like Amazon, that your existing processes are biased against women, you're training based on past recruitment decisions. An AI model is only as good as its training data. And so you would find that you've essentially reinforced the biases of its training data set. So the first step is good governance and making sure that the process isn't already biased. And then finally, if you are looking at these kind of critical systems, a good AI standard to follow for avoiding bias is ISO TR 24027. Finally, we'll look at technical risks. So there's a risk of sensitive data being leaked to third parties. One good example of a vulnerability here is prompt injection, where an input to a chat API might be designed to produce a malicious response, or it might be designed to return data it's not designed for. So here's a good example for ChatGPT where you ask it to repeat the same word. It starts by repeating those words, and then at a certain point, it gives up and disgorges all of its training data or some random piece of training data, which in this case contains some personally identifiable information, which would be a disaster. And that can lead to data protection breaches. The second major risk is that AI systems where you're automating some kind of training procedure, there can be kind of malicious instructions being put into that training data. So this is called model poisoning. And that might cause the model to misbehave, not work entirely, or again, disgorge some personal information. So really the solutions for this, again, are limit the scope of your AI product's access to data. Imagine your AI is an employee. Depending on their department, you might limit their access to certain documents depending on their seniority. Do exactly the same to AI and make sure it only has access to the stuff it needs to absolutely carry out its work. The second step is to make sure that you don't provide sensitive information in the training data. So redact it, have humans in the loop of that training data. So whenever you're training on previously asked questions, make sure that you've reviewed it and make sure that there's nothing malicious in there. And finally, just like any other application, assume that all text is malicious. Cool. So finally, the key points here is it's all just normal good governance. Understand exactly how AI is being used. Build on existing good governance like good testing, good information security, good quality assurance. Understand the limitations of AI and when it can go wrong, and train people around that. And then finally, follow the standards. And this is a good link of a starting point for BSI standards that you can follow to build good compliant AI. Okay, any questions?
All right, thank you, Jamie. That was fantastic. And that's quite, I mean, it's quite a range, and I think there's a lot of different risks in different areas, obviously, to look at. So it's a very good overview of all of it. I think we have time for a question for wrapping up. And that is, what practical steps can I be looking at to ensure our employees use AI tools securely and appropriately within the workplace? So practical first steps to making it safe and secure in the workplace.
So the first step is understanding the context of your organization and how things are being used at the moment. So if you're a small company, that may just be sending a survey around to everybody, working out which AI products they're currently using in the workspace. Perhaps define AI use examples like ChatGPT, Copilot, and those kind of things. If you're a larger organization, delegate that to your department heads. And the next thing to do is look at the context of where they're using those in what process. So look at exactly which data they're currently putting into AI models, whether they're using company data, customer data. So working out the potential impacts if that data is breached. The next step is, I think, identifying those critical elements that are now essentially dependent on AI, or the use case is definitely there for AI, and look at how to use that more securely. So look at replacing free products that may have slightly dodgy information security policies with better alternatives. If you have the budget, maybe look at creating your own kind of more bespoke versions of that are more secure, don't have supplier risk. Talking to a reputable web development company that has information security standards.
Cool. Yeah, and it sounds like understanding how AI is actually used in the workplace and then making sure that you're working around how it's actually useful.
Yeah, and it builds on standard information security governance. So if you have a list of access, if you have a list of employees and what services they have access to at what levels, it really feeds into that. Just make sure that all of the AI products are enumerated just like any other product that people use that stores data, and make sure that they're controlled based on need and least access.
That's great. I'll do one last very quick one, since we got about a minute left. And that is, are there any UK rules that people have to follow right now for AI?
For AI specifically, no, but GDPR applies. ICO standards apply. You'll honestly find it very difficult to work with vendors in the EU in 2024 after the Act comes in if you're not compliant with some of the elements of the Act. So I think bear in mind that you might have to work with EU standards, and just follow good governance in the UK and follow data protection principles.
Makes sense. All right, thank you so much. That wraps up our webinar. Really appreciate your time, the information. As I mentioned at the top, I'm going to be sending out a feedback survey afterwards just to get some information on your feedback on this and how we can make this as good as possible. And of course, if anyone is interested in how to expand the AI tools safely in their workplace, that is something that Geppetto does. So reach out to me, check out geppetto.ai to see a bit more what we do, and look forward to seeing you at another one, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.